Devon Zuegel is a longtime contributor to open source projects. I know several of you have followed her work for many years from afar. I have. And now she's developing GitHub's first funding model for open source projects. Devon is here to share stories and insights from the front lines of the open source software world. She's really into urban planning, and Devon will use the lens of cities to get you thinking about these open source topics. When asked if she'd ever met anyone from the internet in person, she said that basically describes everyone I know, which is like, same. Please join me in welcoming Devon Zuegel.
Thanks. Hello, I am Devon, and I'm the product lead of GitHub Sponsors, and I'm so happy to be here. So I'm a developer, an open source economist, sort of an armchair anthropologist, so you might be wondering what I'm doing here at a design conference. And it's because I've been hearing from some of the people in this room, the people at Figma, that design is really at the precipice of its open source moment. There's been so much more remixing happening recently. People are doing this multiplayer thing. You're all coming together and sharing each other's work and building on top of each other. And so I am just so excited to see this and to learn from all of you. I'm also here to share a little bit of the lessons that I've learned from studying open source communities, helping them, building them, funding models, and just being friends with them. And I thought that it would be useful to share some of these stories with you as you embark on this journey all together. So we're going to take the lens of doing it through some cities. And this is because I adore cities, and I've also been told that designers like to geek out about urban planning almost as much as I do. So today we're going to take a journey through some of my favorite cities in the world. They are going to be from Paris to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Japan, and beyond. And it's going to just be an amazing ride. So I'm really looking forward to this journey with you. Let's start our journey with Paris. Paris is one of the most beloved cities in the world, but it wasn't always this way. Paris of the early 1800s was a complete mess. It didn't have sewage. It had extremely narrow streets that were from the medieval ages. It didn't have just basic public health precautions. And the result was just really a lot of human trauma and horrible living standards. 4 out of 7 infants didn't make it to their first birthday. And so the level of human tragedy that was just caused because of this mess that was the city was immense. So in the mid-1800s, Emperor Napoleon III appointed this man named Baron von Houseman to be the czar of the city. And he said, Houseman, you can do whatever you want, just solve this problem, save the babies, fix the city, and make it beautiful. Houseman took him up. He added modern sewage, and instantly that problem of cholera that was killing so many people went away. He widened the boulevards, and he made Paris one of the most beautiful cities in the world. If any of you haven't been, it's as amazing as people say. And a big part of this was that he was able to make really big steps on his own accord without having to ask a lot of permission, because he had to make some really big changes really fast. He did it in just 17 years. And so here's a photo of Paris that I just absolutely adore. It centers onto the Arc de Triomphe, which is one of the big landmarks of the city. And I love this picture because it just has beautiful radial symmetry, and it shows how Paris was a city that was planned from above, both literally and figuratively. And so you were able to get this gorgeous panorama, which was a very clear vision of Baron von Houseman. There's another reason I like this picture too, though, and it's a lot darker. So if you look at these avenues that just slice through the city, you can kind of see where the old medieval streets were, where these neighborhoods, these businesses, these homes were. And von Houseman, when they were in the way of his grand avenues and his grand plans, he just said, tough luck. Your house is going to be bulldozed. You're going to move to the outskirts of the city. It's for the greater good, and we're going to just keep moving on because progress. And these people really didn't get to have a say in the way that their city changed. Now, I imagine they were probably pretty happy that their babies were making it to their first birthdays now, and many of these people were pleased with the changes wrought on their city. But at the same time, they would have definitely preferred not to have their house torn down. And there's a lot of human misery that's shown in this photo too. So I think the story of Paris is very bittersweet. On one hand, it's created this beautiful jewel of a city that we all get to enjoy today. But on the other hand, it came at a cost. And that cost was people's voices weren't necessarily included in the process. So let's come a little bit closer to home, a little closer to modern day, to something that really reminds me of Paris. And no, we're not going to come to San Francisco. It's the Elm programming language, of course. Don't you see the resemblance? I think it's uncanny. No? OK. Well, I'll walk you through it. So Elm is a beautiful language. People who develop in this programming language just adore it. It is well designed. It has a cohesive vision for what programming should be. And people speak of Elm as like they've sort of found the holy grail of what programming languages should be. And especially when they're doing something that was originally designed for the language, they are just thrilled. And they have this beautiful, happy path that's a delight to program in. The author of Elm is this guy named Evan, who I've spoken to a few times to hear about how he runs the community. And Evan has had this very clear vision from the beginning of what Elm should be. But the actual meaning of what it becomes has changed over time. So Elm was started in 2011. And 5 years later, in 2016, after there was a fair bit of usage of the language, Evan sort of had this realization from talking to people in the community and realizing that there was, even though people loved Elm, there was sort of this underlying problem with part of the architecture that was called signals. And he realized that signals weren't really necessary anymore, and it was making the language much more complex for no apparent reason. And so because he had to keep it all in his head, and he wanted to have this cohesive vision of what his project would be, after talking to some people in the community, he made the decision that they were going to take signals out, which really changed the way Elm works. In that period of time, he made a lot of efforts to try to make the transition smooth. He gave people tools that would allow them to transition. But at the end of the day, he made this big decision largely on his own, though again referring to some people. And he made it very quickly. He gave people 2 weeks to transition off of signals into these new systems. And the choice itself was very much appreciated by the community, and people I've spoken to since say it was like clearly the right decision to remove signals, much like it was the clear right decision to put modern sewage into Paris. But on the other hand, it was quite a surprise to some people in the community, and some people perceived it as Evan taking some steps that they weren't necessarily fully brought into. And so when I talked to Evan, he says that he has decided that he's going to try to make even more of an effort in the future to make sure that there's a longer period of time that he can pull people in and make sure that they have testing and their input is brought in. And so it's been so interesting for me to talk to Evan about how he thinks about these trade-offs as he moves forward in his community. Okay, so now we're going to go to a city that is very different from Paris. And that city is San Francisco, which we're all fairly well familiar with. So San Francisco, I adore. I live here. It's a beautiful city. But San Francisco definitely has some problems. I'm not going to list all of the problems because I only have a 30-minute time slot, but I promise you the list is very long. One of the biggest problems in my mind is that we have a severe housing shortage. I'm also going to spare you of my rants about land use policy in San Francisco. But the long story short is that we need to build more housing. There's a lot of people who want to come live here. There's not very many places for them to live. And so the housing prices have skyrocketed in the last few decades. It's really a severe problem for the whole city. A big part of the problem is this one tool that people use called discretionary review. Discretionary review is this law that's on the books of San Francisco that's pretty unique. And the way DR works, discretionary review, is that it basically says anytime you have a complaint, anyone, about a project that is going to be built, we'll stop and we will hold a hearing to hear your opinion. What this means in practice is maybe I live in Noe Valley and there's a project happening in the Mission or Pacific Heights or something like that. and I just don't like the color of paint of that building. And so what I can do is I can say, discretionary review is necessary. Let's host one. I want to talk about the color of paint. That color of mauve is just not right. And while I'm sure a lot of people in this room have a lot of opinions about the color of paint, we also sometimes need to move forward as a community, and we can't necessarily listen to every single voice. Because when you're making decisions, you're never going to have an entire community that agrees unanimously on almost anything. And so the problem with discretionary review is that you're able to stall projects for almost no reason whatsoever, and it means that projects just kind of don't happen, and it's too high risk for developers to come in and build apartment buildings that are very much needed for the city. So I'm sure you're all thinking, like, why don't we just get rid of discretionary review? It's like clearly a huge part of the problem. Let's just wipe it away, move on. Let's go to this glorious future where San Francisco is growing again. And the problem is that the story is actually a little bit more nuanced. While I think that discretionary review is very, very poorly written and is riddled with problems, it comes from a very long history that's actually very complicated. So in the mid-20th century, in the last century, there was this comprehensive highway plan, is what it was called. And the idea, you can see in these maps, that it just sliced right through the city, a bunch of different highways. This is when the 101 was planned, and a bunch of other highways. And over the course of the mid-century, each decade, they added a few more highways into the city. But these highways disproportionately impacted low-income and minority neighborhoods, and they just kind of ruined the city. They created these urban chasms that segregated neighborhoods from each other and created a mess, created a lot of pollution within the city. And so by the 70s, San Franciscans had had enough. They agreed with me that these were a bad idea, and 30,000 San Franciscans, which is a huge portion of the city's population, signed a petition saying, no more highways, we are done. Luckily, people actually listened this time, people in City Hall who had this centralized power, and they started putting in place new rules like discretionary review, which made it possible for people to air their voices for really the first time when it came to urban planning. And so I think discretionary review comes from a good place, and it actually was a step in the right direction when it was first added. But today, it's just too vague and leaves too much room for interpretation, and you can really make anything into a discretionary review. Now it's not, this highway is going to bulldoze all of the neighborhood and all of my friends and family's homes. It's, I don't like the color of the paint on this building. So I think this centralization and decentralization from Paris to San Francisco and Elm to San Francisco, it's a pendulum, and we're always trying to find the right balance in the middle. So a programming community that really reminds me of San Francisco is the JavaScript standard. It's called ECMAScript, and it's basically what defines what JavaScript is. And the way decisions are made in ECMAScript is that there's a committee that is supposed to represent the entire JavaScript community, which is huge, as you all know. It's the biggest programming community in the world, and it has to be compatible with tons of different browsers, including old versions that are out of date, including your old IE6. And so they have to keep in mind a ton of different stakeholders. And because it's this core foundation of the internet, if ECMAScript breaks something backwards compatibility, then they break the internet. So they have a lot of responsibility, and they take that responsibility very seriously. And as a result, it takes them a very long time to make decisions and to really move forward and make major changes to the language. And again, this comes from a very important place, because people have built their entire businesses, their lives, their access to their bank accounts, on JavaScript. And so it's incredibly important that we don't break that backwards compatibility. But the trade-off is that we end up evolving JavaScript much more slowly than maybe something like Elm, which serves a different purpose in the community. So to step back, as we talked about San Francisco and Paris and Elm and JavaScript, the point that I'm trying to make is not that centralization is good and decentralization is bad, or vice versa. It's that it's complicated. These are trade-offs that every community has to make. The way that you distribute power and decision-making within a community is complex and comes with a bunch of different outcomes down the road. And really, it's a question of choosing which trade-offs you want to make. So as you go forth into your own design communities, I want to leave you with a thought that it's useful to think about these sorts of trade-offs as you design the communities, as you lead them, and as you join one that may have already existed to understand what can you expect from the governance and the decision-making moving forward. Okay, so on to our next city. We're going to zoom out from San Francisco, away from Paris, and we're going to head to the Big Apple, New York City. Yeah, it's a pretty great city. I mean, to be honest, the real reason I decided to do this talk was because I got to just talk about my favorite cities with you all. So New York is amazing, and the subway is really one of the big symbols of the city. But unfortunately, the city has not done a very good job of investing in the New York City subway in a very long time. You can see this photo of Chambers Street Station. It's falling apart. There's like mold. It's gross. But it's not just unattractive. It's actually just not working for the city. The trains have been coming really late. It took them an entire generation to build a new extension to the 2nd Avenue subway. And trains get stuck in the tunnels underground in the dark for sometimes hours. That doesn't happen that often, but you only need it to happen once for it to be pretty unpleasant. And so I think this is really sad because it really clogs up the city. It shows that the city is not thinking in the long term. But this is not a fundamental problem with subways. Another great city, Hong Kong, has a very different set of circumstances with their subway. Their transit system is called the MTR, Mass Transit Railway, and their stations are literally shiny. They just like glow, and they're so clean. The trains come on time almost all the time. When I was in Hong Kong about, I think, 18 months ago, I remember there was a train that was like 2 minutes late, and someone came onto the loudspeaker apologizing profusely in Cantonese. And the friend that I was with was translating for me, and I was just like, wow, if Bart was only 2 minutes late, what a dream. Wow. So Hong Kong really has its shit together, and they have done a very good job of investing in their long-term infrastructure. And one of the key pieces of this is something that is called land value capture. So the way land value capture works is basically, the basic concept is you can imagine there's a city with a transit network, and then there's a neighborhood over here, and that neighborhood is not very much connected to the network. Maybe there's like a donut shop or something in that neighborhood. It doesn't get a lot of foot traffic. Sad donut shop. If you add a station in that neighborhood, connecting it to the rest of the city, now suddenly that donut shop has tons of foot traffic. The city is happier because they have access to the donuts, and the land value prices increase because now it's connected to the rest of this network. And so what's happened is transit has created value out of nothing. Like, it's grown the pie for everybody. What happens in New York is that's where the story ends, and that's it. And the New York City subway still has to go beg for tax money. The MTR in Hong Kong has a very different approach. What they say is, we created this value, and it's a lot of value. We don't even need to capture all of it, but we just need to capture a small fraction, and we can invest that back into the transit system and help us build the next train station. And so they have this system that allows them to grab some of that funding, bring it back into the system, and continue that virtuous cycle of funding the projects that are creating the value and vice versa. And as a result, you have this beautiful system that works so well. So the way this ties back to open source is that because open source software and open source design is largely about giving things away for free, people haven't talked very much about funding this infrastructure, which I sort of think of it as digital infrastructure. And this creates some problems down the road. And I think we've started to see some of those costs in the software community for sure, and I'm sure in the design community. As you explore what it means to do open source, you'll also run into like, how can we invest back in and create that virtuous cycle? So as I mentioned, I work on GitHub sponsors, and our entire goal is to build funding models for open source so that we can create those virtuous cycles and benefit everybody. We're just getting started. We've built a few basic funding models to start with, but in the long term, I really hope to see that we're creating that virtuous cycle and benefiting both the users and the creator of open source for the long term. As you all think about funding your own communities, I think you should draw on land value capture and hopefully the future success of GitHub sponsors as inspiration for how you could fund your own work and make sure that it's really sustainable in the long term so that we all win in the end. All right, so that was New York and Hong Kong. We're going to head back to California, but this time we're going to go to LA. Unfortunately, on our way there, we are probably going to get stuck in traffic. Not very much fun. I'm also not very much fun when I'm on a road trip to LA, because I always like to remind my friends, not only are we stuck in traffic, but we are the traffic. And what that means is that every time you get on the road, you are creating traffic for everybody else. Doesn't mean you shouldn't get in your car. Doesn't mean you should stop going places. But you have to remember, when you are like honking hard at the person in front of you, the person behind you is just as annoyed. And so congestion is a problem that plagues a lot of cities. It's also a problem that plagues open source projects. And what this looks like is in the context of issues, or like the tickets that people open to ask for help on an open source project. And so here's a project called Joplin that I use, I also contribute to. I would like to think I'm more helpful than annoying to the maintainer, but realistically, I probably create a lot of work for him. And every time I open an issue, I first have a moment of like, well, you know, I wish they would respond faster. I wish they would like go more quickly. But then sometimes I realize that, oh man, when I open this issue, I'm making a line longer for everybody else. So now everyone behind me also has to wait a longer time. And so there's this challenge of you have to sort of outweigh there's this huge asymmetry between the number of people who create the open source software we use and open source design and the number of people who use it. Something like Joplin, I don't know the exact numbers, but there's one core guy who works on it. There's a few core contributors who help him. But then there's at least thousands of users, probably more than that. I just don't know the number. And what this means is that it can be completely overwhelming for someone who runs an open source project because there's the potential for the entire internet to be yelling at you. It's pretty stressful. And so when we think about congestion, I think it's also useful to think about this in terms of an open source project, like let's say an icon kit. Let's say you open source an icon kit and you create 100 beautiful icons for the world, you put them out there, people love you, they use it, and then someone starts asking like, could you add a microphone icon? Why don't you have a waffle icon? There's not a meatloaf icon? How is that possible? And it just goes on, and people will start asking you to do things and insisting on all these things. And maybe you do want that waffle icon. Maybe that's exciting to you. But when everyone is rushing at you with feedback and ideas for how to improve the project, it means that it's harder to get to the most important feedback. And you end up having an increase of noise relative to the signal. And so to sort of come back to our city analogy, I think we can look to some cities for solutions to traffic problems. Unfortunately, LA hasn't taken notes on this one quite yet, but I hope they're watching this talk. So from LA, we're going to go to Singapore. And Singapore has something that's called congestion pricing. This is one of the main highways that comes from the airport. It is a beautiful highway. And you can see in like the middle of the day, it's almost totally empty. That might just be sort of a fluke. I actually don't really know when they took this photo. But I can tell you that the few times I've been to Singapore, there's very rarely a serious traffic problem. And that's because the way congestion pricing works is it says every time you get on the road, every time you drive a mile, you pay a little bit of money. And that little bit of money is to offset the cost that you're imposing on everybody else by being on the road. And it's a very small amount of money. It's maybe a few cents per mile, maybe less. I'm not really sure. And it may vary depending on how far you go, how much time you're on the road. It definitely adjusts by the time in the day, so you'll get charged more at peak traffic time and charged less in the middle of the night when the streets are already empty. And what this does is it makes people just think a little bit harder about, like, do I really need to make this trip right now? If I have my 11 a.m. meeting, do I have to drive to work at 7:30 in the morning? Could I just shift my journey by an hour or two? Or maybe, actually I don't need to do this at all. I can just call into this meeting. Now, there's definitely problems with congestion pricing, which I would love to talk with you all about after this. And there's nuances here too. It's no silver bullet, but it is super useful. And I've talked to a lot of drivers in Singapore, and they adore this system because it means that they never ever get stuck in traffic and they never have to honk their horn at somebody. So in the context of open source, whether it's software or design, you're building an icon kit, I think we could look to congestion pricing as inspiration for how to solve some of our problems. Don't worry, we're not about to put a toll booth in front of GitHub issues, but I think that we're starting to see some open source projects experiment with things like this. I've seen one maintainer who said, if you sponsor me on GitHub sponsors, then I will prioritize your issues because you've now shown to me that you're invested in my work. And it is a stronger signal that you really care about what's happening with this project, as opposed to some drive-by person who just opens an issue and says, this project sucks. You can ignore that one. That's fine. And so I'm excited to see more experimentation in this realm. I think open source has not solved this problem yet, whether it's design or software. But I'm really excited to see people starting to think in these terms. And I hope that the traffic analogy inspires you to think of even better solutions than the ones that I've described. All right, so we're coming out of Singapore, and we went to Los Angeles, and we have one last stop on our journey before we come back home, and that's Saitama, Japan. And as you just saw from Craig, who came from Japan, Japan is a beautiful country. It's famously super clean. If you've ever been to Japan, you could almost eat off of the sidewalks. It's so nice. It's beautiful. The air is fresh. It's lovely to walk around. But similar to Paris, it was not always that way. So I wonder if anyone will guess what these barrels are. Yeah, I don't think you want to guess. They're what's called night soil barrels, and they contain human excrement. Which is a really shitty situation. Let's just put it that way. As late as the 1970s, so really, really recently, within probably your family's lifetime, Saitama, which is a city of 1 million people, did not have central sewage. I'm just gonna let that sit for a little while. It was nasty. And you would walk down the street, you would see these barrels, you would probably smell them first, and it was just a mess. On top of how gross it was also very expensive to service. To remove these barrels from the city was really inefficient and costly. It just was a bad system all around. And so in the 1970s, the residents of Saitama said, we've had enough. We are going to solve this problem for once and for all. And they put in central sewage. They did it in a way that was minimally disruptive to the city. They came up with some novel technological solutions that allowed them to open the ground without disrupting as many pipes, which is another talk, but it's very interesting technical solutions. And over the course of less than a generation, they went from 4% of the population connected to central sewage to almost everybody. And the remaining people, don't worry, they don't still have night soil. They have septic pumps or something like that. And so I tell this story because it gives me a lot of hope. Japan is now a beautiful place with very modern plumbing, in fact, more modern than here in many cases. It's a lovely place to be. It's very well run. But they actually just got their shit together, literally and figuratively, in the last few decades. And so I think this gives me a lot of hope because every once in a while when I'm in the trenches of open source, I think, man, these problems are really hard. Are we ever going to solve them? But open source is about as old as Saitama's sewage. So we have a lot of hope to move forward, and I think these problems that seem so insurmountable sometimes are absolutely something that we can solve if we work together and we think of clever solutions. Okay, we have gone on a long journey together all around the globe. You guys are great travelers. And I just want to close with some thoughts around communities. And basically, I think you all are really the leaders of the design community. I've already spoken to a few of you today, and it's so fun to hear about all of the little experiments that you're running with how your open source communities can work, what that will look like. And I hope that some of the stories I've told about how these city communities and these software communities solve some problems will give you inspiration about how your design communities can solve problems too. At the same time, some of this is going to be really an unbeaten path. You're going to be solving new problems as well, and probably solving problems I don't even know exist quite yet. So I would love to stay in touch as you all go on this new journey together, and let me know what you learn. So thank you for having me, and good luck.